Okay, so in this video we're going to continue with our render script. So let's right click on our tool, come down to edit tool, and now we can continue editing this script. I'm going to take use of this temporary function that we created last time, since we're going to be building a function that's going to render out different passes, and it's going to do that by setting various parameters and then calling on the render functionality of our render node. And that function needs to know about our render list, it needs to know about our render node, and so it can create the file name and directory structure. It needs to know the shot name and the file base. So since it's taking in those 4 pieces of information, it makes sense to reuse this function which is taking in the information, but give it a different function name, something that's more descriptive of what we're actually doing. So I'm going to rename from temp description file print over to render description file. And since we're calling on this function, we do need to rename our function call also to render description file. So after we've gone through and we've walked through our description file line by line and generated all the data we need to render, we're now going to call on render description file, passing on that data. So in here, all we now need to do is loop through all of the data that we've got in that array of render info and simply set up our state ready to render, fire off the render, and then loop onto the next item in that array and repeat. So, to loop through all the items in our render list, we can use a for loop. So let's say for render item in render list, which is going to go through all of the items in our render list array and one by one set render item equal to those and then execute the code that belongs to this for loop. And what do we need to do for each of these render items? Well, we need to, on our render node, we need to set our candidate objects. We need to set our candidate lights. We need to deal with setting all of our light-based parameters, whether we're doing a diffuse pass or a specular pass or a shadow pass. There's various things we need to do. And then we need to set up our file name, including directory structure, making sure that that directory structure actually exists on disk. And then we need to go ahead and fire off the render. In this video, we're going to deal with our candidate object parameter, the candidate's light parameter, and our file name. And then in the next video, we'll come back and deal with setting up for our different lighting passes. So to set our visible objects parameter, so set visible objects, we're going to access a parameter on our render node, so on our node, and that parameter is going to be the object. And we can see that if we come back over to our mantra node, over to the objects tab and hover over candidate objects, that parameter is indeed called the object. And we're going to set that to be our render items O member. If you recall, when we're going through our render description and we hit the objects command, we save the argument, which are all the objects we wish to render, into the O member of that render info. So here, if we set that parameter to the O member, we're going to set the parameter to the objects we wish to render. We can do the same for our lights, so set active lights. In this case, the parameter we're going to set is going to be a light. Again, if we come over to our mantra node, we can see that the candidate lights parameter is called a light. And we're going to set that to be our render items L member. I'm now going to comment in the section dealing with setting up for render passes, and we can come back and flesh this in the next video. So we're going to set up for render passes, which could be setting up for a diffuse pass, could be setting up for a specular pass, or could be setting up for a shadow pass. Once we've done that, we're going to set up for our file name. And this is going to be simply concatenating various pieces of information that we've got to build the directory structure and file name that we saw over here. So let's scroll up. I believe on one of these layers we've broken it down nicely. So we've got, for our directory structure, we're going to have the file base, / our shot name, / our object name, and then for the file name we're going to have object _ light _ pass $f3 our file extension. So let's build our directory structure first. So our directory name is equal to our file base plus, we need double / so we can get a single / due to the escape character. We're then going to take our shot name, add to that another /. We're then going to add render items object name, the object name being the nickname that we give representing the object that we're rendering as opposed to being the true objects that we're rendering. And then on the end of that, we're going to append a final backslash, and that's going to complete our directory name. Now for our file name, that's going to be equal to our render items object name plus an underscore plus our render items light name plus an underscore plus our render items pass type plus $F3, and obviously we're going to have a dot before and after the $F3. Now we could go ahead and hard code .pick into here. Instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is come up to the top of our script and create a variable that I'm going to call file type and set that equal to pick, just so if we want to change our file type, we don't have to dig through all the code, we can simply come to the top and change that. So and then on the end, I'm going to append that file type variable we just created. So now we've got our directory name and our file name. Now what we need to do, we need to go ahead and make sure that this directory structure exists, and if it doesn't exist, we need to basically create those directories before we go ahead and render, because otherwise the Mantra render node will error out. To do this, we need to take advantage of the operating system functionality that can come with Python, and to get access to that, we need to import a module. So I'm going to come up to the top of our script, and I'm going to import the OS module, which contains lots of functionality to deal with dealing with operating systems. And now that we've imported the OS module, we can call on that functionality, and I'm going to call on some functionality called OS makeDirs. And makeDirs, if we specify a directory structure, will create all the directories in that directory structure that don't yet exist, but really we only need to call makeDirs if we don't already have that path. So we're going to be calling makeDirs with our directory name, but I'm going to nest this inside an if statement such that we can check if not our os.path.isdir. So if this directory doesn't exist, and that's our directory name, then we want to make that directory. We do need to put a colon in the end of that if statement. So if the directory name that we've specified doesn't exist, then go ahead and make those directories. Once we have our directory name and our file name, we can also concatenate those to produce our output picture, which is the parameter on our render node, and that is the VM_picture parameter. So now that we've got those, we can say our rnode.parm VM_picture.set and set that to our directory name plus our file name. So now that that's in place, we can simply go ahead and tell this current loop, this current render item, to go ahead and render. Since we set up all of our various parameters on our render node, and we will be setting up all of the parameters we need for rendering a particular pass type, we can now go ahead and fire off the render. So let's render the current render item. And that's as simple as calling on some functionality that our render node has, and that is the render method. So if we call on the render method, that's effectively grabbing our Mantra render node and coming up and clicking on the render button. So what we've done, we've gone ahead and we've set up our visible objects, we've set up our active lights, we will be setting up for our pass. We then set up our file name, and then we click render. Once that render completes, we come back and we loop. We bring in the next item in our render list, we set up visible objects, set up active lights, we'll set up for our render pass, we'll set up our file name, and we'll render. However, if we're going to be changing some of our light settings here, after we render, before we bring up the next render, it would make sense to make sure we restore the light settings. So I am going to put a comment in there that we need to come in and restore our light settings after the render. So you can see we come in with our render list, which is a list of all the different renders we want to do, and one by one we set up all the parameters we need for that render, then fire off the render, and then loop. And with that, that's going to conclude this video. Thanks a lot.